From every point of view, the figure of Franklin Roosevelt marked a before and after in American political history. Not only was he the first and only president to be elected not only 3 but 4 times, but in the face of the Great Depression of '29, his famous program, the New Deal, displaced the old American economic order for a new one in which the state assumed a greater presence in civil life. But his imprint goes far beyond the national. Roosevelt and the power groups that surrounded him led the United States into the Second World War against the opinion of the majority of Americans, a bloody war, but from which the United States ended up emerging as the undisputed world superpower. Roosevelt was one of the architects of the international order that we still know today, one of those responsible for internationalizing the Monroe Doctrine, in which the owners of the United States would not only be the police of the American hemisphere, but the police of the whole world, and in which so-called democratic and liberal values had to be exported to all nations of the planet. A sort of American Caesar seen by some as a deeply democratic and progressive president who favored the working class and overcame the crash of '29, and others seen as an agent of financial power who shook the foundational principles of the nation, massively indebted his country, and promoted a less balanced international order. Today we are going to learn about his fascinating story. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work, simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below, you can also get a Patreon link where any collaboration is more than welcome. Without further ado, let's get started. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882 in Dutchess County in the state of New York. He was the second son of his father, James, but the only son of the wealthy marriage between his father and Sarah Delano, who were 26 years apart. Franklin's father was a lawyer by profession, but his fortune was in the field of business, railroads, and land ownership. He was part of the Roosevelts who had put down roots in New York many decades ago, with one sector of the family affiliating with the Democratic Party and another with the Republican sector. His mother's family, on the other hand, also stood out for their aristocracy and wealth, although they were more linked to the commercial sector and maritime navigation. Franklin was baptized in the American Episcopal Church and grew up in a rural-type home where he always had contact with nature. His childhood was marked by the presence of his mother, who decided to homeschool him with the help of tutors to practice sports such as hunting, horse riding, and polo, but his preference was always sailing, thanks to his father. From this time, he had the chance to travel often to Europe, allowing him to learn French and German early on and become familiar with the continent. At the age of 14, his time comes to leave home, and he must move to the state of Boston to attend a high school affiliated with the Episcopal Church. Without standing out academically, he graduates in 1900, and that same year he is admitted to Harvard University in the Bachelor of Arts in History. However, the beginning of this new stage would be overshadowed by the death of his long-lived father at the end of that same year, after a poor state of health. Shortly after this, his fifth cousin, named Theodore Roosevelt, ends up assuming as the 26th President of the United States of America, and Franklin develops a relationship with him whom he saw as a role model to follow. This opens the doors of the White House and all its circle of influence to Franklin, being just a 20-year-old young man, almost 6 feet tall, with brown hair and bluish eyes that gave him an air of youthful vigor. In his journey through Harvard, he goes unnoticed with no other milestones than having stood out as the editor of the university newspaper. From his passive presence in the circles of the White House, he begins to associate with his fifth cousin and also niece of Theodore Roosevelt, Anna Eleanor, whom he is fascinated by her work in charity. Therefore, a romance soon arises between them until a commitment is crystallized at the end of 1903. By then, Franklin had not only completed his studies, but had also developed a full interest in politics, so he returns to New York in 1904 to enroll in the law school of Columbia University. There he begins to pay more attention to the government issues of his fifth cousin, Theodore, who had achieved re-election that same year, and at the beginning of 1905, he formalizes his marriage to Eleanor Roosevelt, conceiving their first daughter a year later. In university, he does not stand out as an exceptional student, but as someone who saw law only as a necessary element to enter the political world. By 1907, he already met the requirements to graduate, but strangely, he does not do so after passing the test to practice law in the state of New York. Thus, he begins to work in a distinguished Wall Street firm in the Maritime Law Division, and just at the end of the year comes the birth of his first son. Although he practices law for some more time, he always does it with the same indifference with which he studied it. His path up to that point seemed to have no clear direction, but that changes around 1910, when he finally attends to his political vein. Well known already in high political circles and a member of an influential family, the leaders of the Democratic Party in the state of New York seek him out to join their ranks and convince him to run as a candidate for the New York State Senate in that year's elections. Franklin was only 28 years old and was already a man of imposing presence, but with a familiar, charismatic, and serene aura. And so the young Franklin is elected as a state senator shortly after the birth of his fourth child that year. So Franklin moves to the state capitol, and there he begins to stand out for a particular fact. He leads a small group of Democratic reformers who counterbalance the well-established old guard of the Democratic Party machinery in New York. Known and famous for exercising strong political control over Manhattan for several decades, by presenting himself as an opponent to patronage and influence peddling, he gains renown in the state. As a significant fact, it is at this stage in 1911 that Franklin formally initiates into Freemasonry, becoming part of the Holland Lodge 8 of his native High Park for 1900. By 1929, he had already reached the 32nd degree of the Scottish Masonic Rite, which was one of the highest, and by the 1930s, he steps into politics. Franklin runs for re-election as a state senator from New York in 1912 and supports Woodrow Wilson in his nomination as a presidential candidate. When Wilson wins the presidency, he immediately repays the support by appointing Franklin as the new Undersecretary of the Navy in 1913. With this, Franklin must leave his senatorial post to embark now on a military task where he had no experience beyond his well-known taste for navigation. Almost at the same time as his fifth child was born in 1914, the most bloody war conflict to date was breaking out in Europe. Despite the neutrality maintained by the United States, Franklin as his secretary is tasked with preparing the maritime military complex. When the United States entered the war, Franklin was now touring foreign naval bases and assisting in the direction of military operations in the Caribbean. On his return, his wife Eleanor realizes that Franklin had been unfaithful to her for a long time and asks for a divorce, but he rejects it for political reasons. They agree to preserve the marriage, but without the intimacy of before and even living separately. With the war over, Roosevelt leaves his post in 1920 to resume his political path, and a display of his abilities, his sympathies, and how much he had climbed in the political establishment is that at the Democratic Party convention. That year, he achieves a historic nomination for the vice presidency of the Republic for that year's presidential elections, alongside Governor James Cox. However, the duo loses to the Republican candidates. Franklin takes a break from politics for a while, but his life changes drastically. In the summer of 1921, while he was on vacation on Campobello Island, southeast of Canada, it was there that he began to experience symptoms of a serious autoimmune disease that, among other things, gradually paralyzed the movement of his limbs. He was 39 years old and was entering the most vital stage of his life. He suffered greatly from this disease and was bedridden for weeks, but his spirits would not be diminished. His charismatic personality is now complemented by a strong determination and character that leads him to try everything to recover. But no method gives him as many benefits as swimming in the waters of the southern United States. thanks to which he gradually regained some mobility in his legs and arms. However, he could never fully recover, and from then on he would not walk without crutches, orthopedic devices, or the support of someone. In the midst of that journey, she went on his behalf to dozens of meetings throughout the state of New York, even becoming a great speaker. These were years that passed without major incidents, where Franklin also manages to bear his agony thanks to his known hobby for stamps, to the point of accumulating thousands of these. History brings Franklin back to the scene at the Democratic Convention of 1924, but from there he would have no more real action until the next convention in 1928, when he is presented with the opportunity to return to the public arena at the age of 46. It was then that the governor of New York, Alfred Smith, encouraged him to run as his successor for the governorship of the state, and although Roosevelt showed some reservations, he eventually presented his candidacy and won the election. In his first year as governor, he had to deal with nothing less than the most catastrophic fall of the New York Stock Exchange, known as the famous crash of '29, the worst financial, economic, and social crisis in the history of that country up to that point. Almost overnight, wealthy New York transformed into a daily scene of poverty, unemployment, hunger, and ruin. Franklin manages to overcome the most immediate difficulties with government aid programs, and in 1930 he is re-elected as governor by a larger margin than the first time. In his second term, he carries out aggressive policies against various state problems and manages to rise as one of the best positioned for the Democratic Presidential Convention, in which Franklin achieves the personal milestone of securing the presidential nomination for the end-of-year elections. This was the most important candidacy of his career, with a challenging campaign due to his physical condition, but whose work was greatly facilitated by the reality of the country. The crash of '29 had left serious economic and social consequences, and the one blamed for the crisis was the incumbent president, the Republican Herbert Hoover. In the face of this scenario, Roosevelt was the alternative option, and thus ends up achieving victory to become the 32nd President of the United States. Roosevelt's first major challenge is the devastating aftermath of the 1929 crash. So at the beginning of his presidency, Roosevelt presents to the Americans his famous New Deal, the controversial reform program that had the official goal of countering the effects of the Great Depression, stabilizing the economy, and addressing the great social discontent. The program consisted of a profound reform of the American economic system and the relationship of the state with society. For this reason, he launched a large set of measures aimed at creating unprecedented public programs for massive social assistance for the unemployed, elderly, poor, and children, the execution of a broad public spending plan to revitalize agriculture and other industrial sectors affected by the crisis, and the stabilization of the financial market that caused the crisis. These measures were presented to Congress in some cases and issued as executive orders in others. With these, massive subsidies were granted from the state, mortgage reliefs were given, and unprecedented government agencies were created for the regulation of various areas, and above all so that companies and individuals could access financial resources through these agencies. In turn, in an attempt to stabilize the banking system and put an end to depositor runs, he approves a banking reform law that, among other things, separates the activities of commercial banking and investment banking, also creating a new federal agency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Another priority area was agriculture, addressed by the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which created another agency to provide state support to affected field producers. Similarly, the industrial issue was at the center of everything, and Roosevelt initiated a broad public works program to stimulate employment while promoting the Industrial Recovery Act to revitalize the sector with the help of a new government agency, the National Recovery Administration. The New Deal program was not exempt from criticism from those who denounced that this massive expansion of public spending was increasing the national debt and the fiscal deficit to alarming levels, in addition to distorting the economy in a way to Americans. For others, the New Deal rather than helping Americans. For others, the New Deal, rather than helping to get out of the Great Depression, extended it with its measures. However, the truth is that the effects of the program, combined with Roosevelt's innovative radio broadcasts from the White House fireplace, achieved something that seemed improbable just a few years ago with the crash of '29, revitalizing American life, restoring confidence in the government, and alleviating some of the harshest hardships of the citizenry. In a timid but steady way, the New Deal began to take effect over the months. For others, the New Deal was a terrible affront to the liberal principles of the free market. They denounced that the New Deal brought an unprecedented expansion of government powers and its economic interventionism with serious medium and long-term consequences. Therefore, several of these reforms had begun to discredit Roosevelt in some business sectors, bankers, and society in general. As a result, the climate of opinion was somewhat polarized. In response to this, the president counterattacked with a new package of reforms delivered to Congress in 1935, known as the Second New Deal. The first major measure of this program was a tax reform to raise taxes on large corporations and people with higher incomes. This was followed by the Social Security Act, which for the first time established something similar to a welfare state for all Americans in the United States, with new pensions for the EGES unemployment insurance and other similar measures. Just as it passed labor laws for the first time that gave workers the right to negotiate their contracts collectively and gave more weight to union groups in the country, in addition to all this, a new agency was created, the Works Progress Administration, which expanded the previous large works program to provide jobs for the unemployed in areas such as road and bridge construction and national park conservation. Some of the measures of the first and second New Deal were rejected by the Supreme Court on the grounds that they were unconstitutional, creating tension between Franklin and the judges. With moderate economic results, the situation was improving, although as we will see later, it would not be until the World War that the American economy and life would rise like never before. Thus, Roosevelt's first government was coming to an end, between national challenges and his physical limitations. His mobility across the country was limited by his condition, and this contrasted with the time when air travel was gaining strength. There was even a tacit agreement with the press to hide his disability, which involved not showing Roosevelt in a wheelchair but only sitting at desks or leaning on podiums. But after his program that reformed the American foundations and granted large public subsidies, his popularity remained strong, and in 1936 he won the presidential re-election by a wide margin, as well as obtaining the majority in both chambers of Congress. So in his first few months, he presents a bill to gain influence in the judiciary, with which he sought to expand the number of Supreme Court justices. And although the project was rejected, the action motivated a change in the rigidity of the conservative judges who opposed him, and from there would be no more blockages to Roosevelt's laws and decrees. Instead, the criticisms of the New Deal would now come from Congress, where a fatigue of reforms was perceived even within the Democratic Party itself. And with the economy on track for sustained recovery, blockages to Roosevelt's new reforms became normal from Parliament, forcing a strong reduction in public spending. After state spending had expanded, it had created dependence in certain sectors. This abrupt reduction brought various economic problems. On the other hand, around this time, Roosevelt became the first president to appear on national television. During the opening of the New York World's Fair in 1939, thus inaugurating a new era in the forms of politics and power. His second term was also marked by the increasing tensions, conspiracies, and struggles that arose among nations and international power groups. With a focus on Europe, far from simple geopolitical rivalries, powerful groups beyond nation-states that in the 20th century had amassed great financial and cultural influence and were leading the world powers towards a fateful war and a new division of the world. The real causes and triggers of the so-called Second World War, as well as the true reasons for the United States' involvement in it despite the opposition of its citizens, is an intriguing topic that will be addressed in another video. The fact is that in 1939, the war conflict breaks out among the European powers, and although the United States officially maintains neutrality, Roosevelt immediately shows his commitment to the countries opposed to National Socialist Germany, helping them in various ways. And when France was occupied and the United Kingdom was at war with Germany, the President of the United States rushes to provide them with all kinds of assistance with resources, logistics, and looking for legal loopholes to send weapons directly to the United Kingdom. The opinion of the American people was clearly against the war. Roosevelt said he was taking these measures to stay out of the war. However, he was slowly plowing the ground for the country to get involved in it. However, it was an election year, and Roosevelt had to be careful of a public opinion that rejected the United States getting involved in the war. And speaking of the election year, while it was not prohibited, it was a Republican tradition that a president in the United States only aspired to 2 terms. But so distinctive was Roosevelt's character and the unspoken plans of the group surrounding him that they broke with this Republican tradition, and unprecedentedly, Roosevelt is nominated for president for the 3rd time and becomes the first president of the United States to govern for a 3rd consecutive term. Under this new mandate, Roosevelt more notably aligns the United States with the Allied side. Looking for ways to circumvent national laws and international agreements, he begins to gradually provide direct and discreet military aid to Allied countries and to restrict the export of essential supplies to countries like Japan. Thus, the nation seemed to be moving closer to war despite the opposition and indifference of the majority of Americans, until the end of 1941, when the infamous attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese Empire took place. It's important to note that various researchers have seriously proposed the thesis that Franklin Roosevelt and the American government not only did everything possible from 1940 to provoke an attack from Japan that would serve as a pretext to enter the war, but they were fully aware of the imminent attack on Pearl Harbor and concealed it to not prevent it. This thesis is based on numerous official documents, memos, and declassified files prior to the attack, and one of the most extensive investigations on the subject is in the book called Day of Deceit by war veteran Robert Stinnett. These hypotheses, as we said, will be addressed in other videos, but the truth is that the United States thus became directly involved in a war declared on both Japan and Germany. At the domestic level, one of the most controversial episodes in the United States occurs when the president signs an executive order that paves the way for the mass imprisonment of Japanese in the country, as well as their descendants, accompanied by a national campaign that justified the war and degraded the Gentiles of the Axis powers. What begins as a military security measure turns into a crude segregation of the population, where it is estimated that more than 100,000 Japanese were confined for several years in the so-called relocation centers, not different from the European concentration camps. It has also been reported that the American state took advantage of this war to reduce the civil liberties of its citizens in ways that have never been recovered. Going back to 1941, earlier that year, the Soviet Union also gets involved in the war, but not against its supposed eternal enemies, the bourgeois, Western, and capitalist democracies, but against German, Italian, and Japanese nationalism. The future Anglo-Saxon-Soviet alliance was thus taking shape. On the other hand, if the New Deal program brought economic revitalization to the United States, the war would bring an unprecedented economic boom. The government and the Federal Reserve would take advantage of this war situation to focus the economy and social life of the United States on the war effort, taking measures that would not be accepted at other times. Thus, the U.S. government assumes loans equivalent to more than 100% of the gross domestic product, incurring stratospheric levels of debt with private banking and pouring that money into the national economy. Not only was the industrial complex revitalized by the government's huge spending on war production, but millions of jobs were also created with this injection of money. In turn, the president authorizes risky large-scale military operations, such as the American invasions of North Africa in 1942 and southern Italy in 1943, while focusing on strengthening the alliance with the Allies who now depended on the United States in their war against the Germans and Italians. This leads him to regularly understand with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill as he manages to get a good approach with the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. When the three meet at the Tehran Conference in 1943 and address the opening of a second front in Western Europe, Roosevelt shows little resistance to the Soviets' requests. Aside from all this, a new electoral process was looming in the United States, and even in the midst of war, or precisely because of it, and the interests surrounding the president, Roosevelt manages to secure an unprecedented fourth nomination from his party, now alongside Harry Truman for the vice presidency. But a good campaign was no longer enough to win. Having led his country into war, Roosevelt knew he needed a show of authority, and this came with the invasion of Normandy in mid-1944. It was the military victory he needed to convey to the people, and it catapulted him in the presidential race. The war meant a reconfiguration of world power, and the United States, with old imperial ambitions along with international banking and other power factors, would seek to take the greatest possible advantage of this war in the construction of a new international architecture, where they would ultimately be the undisputed supreme power, achieving at the end of the war the beginning of a much-desired military and economic dominance, not only in the defeated countries, but in many of their supposedly victorious European allies. Thus, for example, Roosevelt was a promoter of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in 1944, known as the famous Bretton Woods Conference, where the Allied countries met to outline the monetary and financial system after the war, and the power of the moment managed to agree. They're the basis of the future world hegemony of the dollar. From these agreements, institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were born, but the most significant was the implicit adoption of the US dollar as the global reference currency. It is also in these conferences that it is delimited how to distribute Europe and a good part of the world, between the Anglo-Saxon power and the Soviet sphere. With this momentum, Roosevelt faced the final months of the presidential campaign in 1944, although very much at the expense of his health, which had suffered the diagnosis of advanced arteriosclerosis. Even so, he manages to win the presidential re-election for a fourth term, only with the narrowest vote margin of his career. And after being sworn in as president again in 1945, he resumes his efforts in the creation of the new post-war international order with his attendance at meetings such as the Yalta Conference in February, from where the foundations of the so-called United Nations organization would be laid, another world-influenced body like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, where power groups associated with the United States would have much more influence than any other state. After returning to the U.S., his declining health following the trips was evident, even prompting him to appear before Congress for the first time. After this, he decided to take a few days at his Georgia cabin to rest. But just a few days later, on the afternoon of April 12th, Franklin suffers a fatal cerebral hemorrhage that ends his life without letting him see the official end of the war that had consumed him so much, consumed. It was the abrupt end of his 12 years in the White House, from where he influenced all areas of American public life. He transformed the old economic order into a new one, where the state and politics gained an unprecedented presence in national life, also laying the foundations of the so-called welfare state in North America. He also marked a milestone by being the first president to be elected not only 3 but 4 times, while leading his country into a world war with more than questionable results, but which established the United States and its owners as the New World hegemon. His imprint remained for years in the foundations of the Democratic Party and the American people, as well as many of his laws, regulations, and created agencies. Undoubtedly a decisive figure for the country's history. His story is crucial to understand the course not only of the United States during the second half of the 20th century, but also to understand the tribulations of the international order since then. Depending on how you see him, an American leader who pulled his country out of the worst economic crisis and favored the unprotected, or a banking agent who forever undermined the philosophical principles of the nation and its old international policy. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. And don't forget that it is very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and above all, that you collaborate with us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you all, and God bless you.